The house had grown too quiet ever since my husband passed away 2 years ago. The walls seemed to echo with memories. I could still hear his laugh in the living room, his steady footsteps down the hallway, and his voice calling my name. But now the silence was deafening. At night, I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was how the rest of my life would feel. Empty, quiet, and unbearably lonely. I tried to stay busy. Gardening, cooking, volunteering at the church. I did it all, but there was only so much I could do to distract myself from the ache inside. That's when I noticed them. A moving truck pulled up 2 houses down one sunny afternoon. A black family was unloading boxes and furniture, chatting and laughing as they settled into their new home. It wasn't unusual in our neighborhood to see people come and go, but something about them caught my attention, specifically him. He must have been in his early 20s, tall with broad shoulders and a body that looked like it belonged to a professional athlete. His dark skin glistened under the sun as he carried heavy furniture with ease, his muscles rippling with every movement. I stood at my window pretending to dust the blinds, but really, I couldn't take my eyes off him. I felt a rush of something I hadn't felt in years. It was an unfamiliar mixture of curiosity, admiration, and guilt. What kind of woman was I to be looking at a man half my age, especially after everything I'd lost? The days went by, and I found myself glancing out the window more often than I cared to admit. He was always outside, mowing a lawn, washing his car, or tossing a football around. His energy was infectious, and his laughter carried over the fence like a song I didn't realize I needed to hear. One evening, as I was watering my front yard, I saw him walking down the street with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He nodded and smiled at me, a polite gesture, but it sent a jolt through me. "Good evening, ma'am," he said in a deep, warm voice. I blinked, startled that he'd spoken to me. "Good evening," I managed to reply, my cheeks flushing. He stopped and adjusted the bag on his shoulder. "If you ever need help around the house, just let me know. My name's Darius." I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Thank you, Darius. That's very kind of you. I'm Margaret." "It's nice to meet you, Margaret," he said, giving me another one of those disarming smiles before continuing down the street. For the rest of the night, I couldn't stop thinking about our brief interaction. His kindness, his confidence, and the way he carried himself. It was as if he had awakened something in me that I thought had died along with my husband. The next morning I found myself looking out the window again. Darius was mowing the lawn, shirtless this time, his body glistening with sweat. I felt my breath hitch as I watched him, my hands gripping the windowsill. I tried to shake the thoughts from my head, telling myself it was wrong to feel this way. But no matter how much I tried to push it away, the spark of curiosity had already been lit. That evening, I was walking back from the mailbox when Darius waved at me from his driveway. "Hey, Margaret," he called out. I smiled and waved back, my heart pounding as I approached him. "How's it going?" he asked, leaning casually against his car. "Good. Just taking it one day at a time," I replied. He nodded, his expression softening. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm just down the street." I felt a lump rise in my throat. How did he know I was lonely? Did it show that much? "Thank you, Darius. That means a lot." As I walked back to my house, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in years: hope. Maybe, just maybe, life wasn't done surprising me yet. If this story has you hooked, don't forget to like and subscribe for more engaging and dramatic tales. I didn't know when it started, this strange habit of mine. Every morning, I'd find myself standing by the window with my coffee in hand, pretending to enjoy the view, but my eyes were always searching for him, Darius. It was as if my day didn't truly begin until I saw him. Some mornings he'd be jogging, his tall frame cutting through the crisp air with ease. Other times he'd be working on his car, his muscles flexing as he tinkered under the hood. I tried to convince myself it was harmless, just an old widow finding a bit of joy in watching the vibrancy of youth. But deep down I knew it was something more. The neighborhood barbecue was the perfect excuse to see him up close again. Every summer, Mrs. Clark from 2 streets over hosted a gathering in her sprawling backyard. I usually went out of obligation, but this time I found myself looking forward to it. The air was thick with the smell of grilled burgers and ribs, children ran around laughing, and neighbors mingled, exchanging polite small talk. I arrived with my potato salad, scanning the crowd for a familiar face, and then I saw him. Darius was standing by the grill, a plate in hand, laughing at something one of the men had said. He looked so at ease, so confident. When his eyes met mine, he smiled and waved. "Margaret," he called out, making his way toward me. "Hello, Darius," I said, my voice betraying a slight tremble. "I'm glad you came. This party needed some class," he teased, his grin widening. I couldn't help but laugh. "Well, I do my best." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Between you and me, the potato salad here is always terrible. I'm hoping yours can save the day." My heart fluttered at his playful tone. "You'll have to let me know what you think," I replied, feeling a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Later, I found myself in the kitchen refilling my glass of iced tea when Darius walked in. The room felt smaller with him in it, his presence commanding yet comforting. "Need a hand?" he asked, gesturing to the stack of cups on the counter. "I think I've got it, but thank you," I said, though I was keenly aware of how close he was standing. He reached for a cup anyway, our fingers brushing for the briefest moment. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I quickly busied myself with pouring the tea. "You know," he said, his voice softer now, "you're different from the others around here. You actually seem real." I turned to look at him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "That's a nice way of saying I don't fit in, isn't it?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, it's a compliment. You're genuine. It's refreshing." Before I could respond, someone called his name from the yard, breaking the spell. He gave me a quick smile before heading back outside, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. After that night, things changed. I caught myself watching him more often, my eyes lingering a little too long when he waved at me from his driveway. I'd feel a flutter in my chest that I hadn't felt since my younger days. One afternoon, I was sitting on my porch with a book when he walked by with his dog. He stopped at the foot of my steps, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Hey, Margaret," he said, flashing that irresistible smile. "Your porch is looking nice." "Thank you, just trying to keep busy," I replied, closing my book. "If you ever need help with anything around the house, just say the word," he offered again. "Well," I said hesitantly, "my faucet's been leaking in the kitchen. I've been meaning to call a plumber, but—" "I can take a look at it," he said immediately. "I'm pretty handy with that stuff." I hesitated, knowing that inviting him into my home felt like crossing some unspoken line, but his earnest expression disarmed me. "That would be very kind of you, Darius." The next day, he came over with a toolbox in hand. Watching him work in my kitchen, his large hands skillfully fixing the faucet, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Gratitude, admiration, and something deep, something I wasn't ready to admit. "There," he said, standing up and wiping his hands on a rag. "Good as new." "Thank you," I said, feeling a little breathless. "I don't know what I would have done without you." He looked at me then, his dark eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my heart race. "Anytime, Margaret. I mean it." As he left, I stood by the window watching him walk down the street, his broad shoulders illuminated by the setting sun. For the first time in years I felt alive, terrified but alive. It had been a week since Darius fixed my faucet, but the memory of him standing in my kitchen was still fresh in my mind. I replayed our conversations, his easy smile, the way his voice seemed to linger in the air long after he'd left. I told myself it was harmless, a silly crush, a distraction from my loneliness. But deep down I knew it was more. The next time I saw him, it was late in the afternoon. I was pruning the rose bushes in my backyard when he appeared at the fence, holding a cold drink in his hand. "Hey, Margaret," he called out, leaning casually against the wooden slats. I looked up, startled but pleased to see him. "Hi, Darius. How are you?" Good, just finished a workout, he said, gesturing to his damp shirt. Thought I'd say hi. Well, hello, I said with a small laugh, brushing my hands against my gardening gloves. You've been working hard. He grinned. Yeah, trying to stay in shape. You know how it is. I nodded, though I couldn't help but notice how effortlessly perfect he looked, even in the heat. You're putting the rest of us to shame, I teased. He chuckled and tilted his head toward the house. You need help with anything else? I don't mind pitching in. I hesitated, my heart pounding at the thought of him coming inside again. Actually, I was thinking about rearranging some furniture, but it's probably too heavy for me. Say no more, he said, setting down his drink. I'll be right over. Before I could protest, he was walking around to the front of the house. Moments later, he was standing in my living room, his presence filling the space in a way that felt both comforting and overwhelming. What do you need moved? He asked, rolling up his sleeves. I pointed to the couch and a few other pieces, explaining how I wanted to open up the space. He nodded and got to work lifting furniture. The furniture with ease. I stood back watching him, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and desire. When he finished, he turned to me, slightly out of breath. How's that? Perfect, I said, my voice softer than I intended. Thank you, Darius. You've been such a help. He smiled, his eyes meeting mine. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The air between us felt charged, like something unspoken was hanging there, waiting to be acknowledged. Margaret, he said, his voice low, can I ask you something? Of course, I replied, though my heart was racing. Why do you look at me like that? I froze, my breath catching in my throat. What do you mean? He stepped closer, his gaze intense but gentle. You know what I mean. You look at me like you see something in me that no one else does. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth was, he was right. I did see something in him. Kindness, strength, a spark that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. I don't mean to make you uncomfortable, he continued, his voice softening. But I feel it too. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought he might hear it. Darius, I. But before I could finish, he reached out and gently took my hand. His touch was warm, steady, and reassuring. You don't have to say anything, he said. I just wanted you to know. For a moment, I was paralyzed by fear and doubt. This wasn't supposed to happen. I was a widow, old enough to be his mother. But as I looked into his eyes, I felt a pulse stronger than any logic or judgment. Without thinking, I closed the distance between us. Our lips met in a hesitant, tender kiss that quickly deepened, breaking the barriers I had so carefully constructed. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me close, and for the first time in years I felt truly alive. When we finally pulled apart, I searched his face for regret or hesitation, but all I saw was warmth. Margaret, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, you don't have to be alone anymore. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I blinked them away. This feels crazy, I admitted. Maybe, he said with a soft smile. But sometimes crazy is exactly what we need. The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered confessions. We met in secret, careful not to draw attention. Every touch, every kiss, felt like a lifeline, pulling me out of the emptiness I'd been drowning in for so long. But it couldn't last forever. One evening, as we were sitting on my porch, a neighbor walked by and paused, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of us together. Evening, Margaret, she said, her tone dripping with suspicion. Good evening, Mrs. Clark, I replied, forcing a smile. She glanced at Darius, then back at me. Well, isn't this cozy, she said before walking away. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. Darius, what if people start talking? Let them, he said firmly, taking my hand. What we have is real, Margaret. That's all that matters. His words gave me comfort, but I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The days following Mrs. Clark's pointed remark were tense. I couldn't shake the feeling that my neighbors were watching, whispering. It was as though the walls of my safe little world had been breached, and I wasn't sure how to rebuild them. Darius seemed unfazed. He continued coming over, his presence a steady comfort in the storm of my thoughts. But I was growing restless, the weight of our secret becoming harder to bear. One afternoon we were sitting in my living room. The blinds were drawn, the room dimly lit as if the secrecy of our relationship demanded it. "Darius, what if this gets out?" I asked, my voice trembling. He reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "Why do you care what people think, Margaret? We're not doing anything wrong." "It's not that simple," I said, pulling my hand away. "You're young, strong, and full of life. People will judge you for being with someone like me. And I don't care," he said firmly. "You make me happy. That's all that matters." His words were like a balm, soothing the doubts that threatened to consume me. But deep down, I knew the world wouldn't see it that way. A week later, everything came crashing down. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was standing in the kitchen baking a pie. The radio played softly in the background, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace. Then there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, I found Mrs. Clark standing on my porch, her arms crossed and a look of barely contained judgment on her face. "Margaret," she began, her tone sharp. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, my heart sinking. She walked into the living room and glanced around, her eyes landing on the coffee mug Darius had left on the table. "I've been hearing things," she said, turning to face me, "about you and that young man, Darius." I swallowed hard, the pie forgotten. "Mrs. Clark, I don't think this is any of your business." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, but it is. This is a small community, Margaret. People talk. They're concerned about appearances." I felt a surge of anger rise within me. "Appearances? Is that what this is about? You don't care about me or Darius. You just want something to gossip about." Her eyes narrowed. "You're making a fool of yourself, Margaret. And of him. You think this will end well. You're living in a fantasy." Her words cut deep, but I refused to let her see how much they hurt. "Please leave," I said, my voice shaking. She stared at me for a moment before turning and walking out the door. That night I couldn't sleep. Her words played in my mind, each one a dagger to my already fragile confidence. The next day I told Darius we needed to talk. He came over after work, his face lighting up when he saw me, but his smile faded when he noticed the look on mine. "What's wrong?" he asked, stepping inside. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "Darius, I don't think we can keep doing this." His expression darkened. "What are you talking about?" "It's too much," I said, my words tumbling out in a rush. "The neighbors, the judgment, the whispers. I can't live like this." He reached for me, but I stepped back, tears spilling down my cheeks. "Margaret, don't do this. Don't let them win." "It's not about them," I lied. "It's about me. I'm not strong enough for this, Darius. I'm sorry." He stared at me, hurt and disbelief etched on his face. "So that's it. You're just giving up." I couldn't answer. Instead, I turned away, unable to meet his eyes. For days I stayed inside, the weight of my decision crushing me. The house felt emptier than ever, each room a painful reminder of what I'd lost. Then one evening there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, I found Darius standing there, a determined look on his face. "I'm not giving up on us," he said, stepping inside. "Darius, no." "No," he interrupted. "Listen to me. I know you're scared and I get it. But you can't let fear control your life. You deserve to be happy, Margaret. We both do." His words broke something inside me, the walls I'd so carefully built crumbling under the weight of his love. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he said, pulling me into his arms. "But we'll face it together." In that moment, I knew I couldn't walk away from him, no matter what the world thought. He was worth the risk, the whispers, the judgment. We decided to stop hiding. People wanted to talk, let them. For the first time in years, I felt free, unburdened by the weight of others' expectations. Our love wasn't conventional or easy, but it was real. And in the end, that was all that mattered.